Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of us discussing software modernization. I'm Sam.
I'm Abdul.
I'm Mike.
Excellent. We got the formalities out of the way. So we've covered a little bit so far in the previous episodes around sort of general responsibilities of software modernization, how it compares a little bit to greenfield projects, and everywhere in between. I think today we'll see what the conversation takes us, but I think we wanted to delve a bit more into starting a software modernization. How do you really get off the ground with the discovery and those really early stages of a software modernization project? So I'm going to start it off a little bit with just giving a brief explanation of one of the ways that I've seen work quite well in the past, which is Golden Master. And I'll give an explanation of that, just in terms of just a high-level technique that you can use. So I'll describe the situation a bit. So you're in a software modernization project. You come across this code base that has little to no testing, and you're sort of like, it needs to be modernized. We're skipping a few bits here, so we're assuming that you've already identified it's an area that, of importance to the business. It needs to be modernized. But it's one of those situations where you're afraid to touch it. And if you do touch it, things might go bang. So what you can do, and Mac, I know you've done some slightly interesting techniques with Golden Master, so we'll probably get into that a little bit as well. But one way is the Golden Master technique, which is also known as Golden Master testing. And what it is you have this software, and basically think input, output. Of course, it's not necessarily always that simple. It could be right into a database. It could be various different things. So it's not necessarily output as in just a console application. But the idea being that you load various different inputs into it. So you input into the system, you use it, and then you record what it does. So you take effectively a snapshot in time of the behavior. And in the simpler examples, you'll see across the internet, it'll be sort of right into a like a text file or something. Right, it'll write the inputs and then also the outputs as well. And then the idea is that then you make some changes to the software, because now you have that snapshot of the behavior, and then you then can rerun it, and you can say, have I broken anything? Are the inputs and outputs still the same? Of course, the big assumption is that the current behavior is correct, which of course, during that process of generating the Golden Masters, you might look at the data and say, oh, is this right, etc. But depending on the size of the Golden Masters. So that's just one way that I've found it's been really useful to give you some confidence to actually change the software where there are sort of little to no tests. Obviously, if you already have an existing test suite, that's a different matter, assuming it's a good test suite. Although, Mac, do you want to give your views? I know Golden Master, I didn't want to jump straight into a solution, but I know that's one way that people in that situation of coming to a piece of software, you're on a modernization project, that's one avenue you can go down. Obviously, we're missing out a few of the steps before here, but we can get back and discuss those in a minute.
Yeah, probably we missed the entire analysis and discovery. So we already know what we have to do, but in the end, in most of the cases, because of the software being very old and no one understands it, there is little to no documentation. The people who created it are no longer there. So one of the ways to understand it is write those characterization tests, which is like Golden Master test, basically, right? So understands not on functional level, because still that will take too much time. You just throw in some inputs to it, get some outputs, and with some auxiliary tools, you just make sure that these tests cover, let's say, 90% plus of the code base that you're about to modernize, let's say. So that gives you the confidence, the safety net to try and refactor a bit, actually, right? Because you cannot just TDD your way from the beginning, really, right? This is something that comes a bit later. Once you have that initial safety net suite of tests, and how much is necessary and how big it should be depends on the context, I guess. But from my experience, it's always good to have it in place in one way or the other, basically. Yeah. But yeah, not sure if you want to get down a bit more into the details of it, or
yeah, we can. Well, we can take a rewind back and sort of go back. I said we sort of skipped a few few bits and pieces. But one thing I sort of was going to just briefly mention off the back of what you said, Maciej, was that there are tools as well that can obviously help. So obviously, a lot of developers use Git, and there's a wealth of information to sort of to mine there. And tools like CodeScene, SonarQube can sort of give you some useful information in terms of hotspots that are changed, etc. Because as you mentioned earlier on, you sort of arrive at this code, and the people that maybe worked on it maybe have left, and it's sort of, you know, that maybe has happened several times that people have come and then left, and so they're sort of, maybe their knowledge doesn't carry on, and so maybe apart from some documentation, you can sort of use some of that information to see, well, actually there are particular hotspots, and you can say this is being changed a lot, or in some cases you can then say, well, this was actually changed by this one person that left, you know, 5 years ago, or whatever. So you can get some really interesting information from there. Obviously, this is once you've identified the thing to be modernized, you can get some nice, interesting statistics there as well as complexity, etc., etc.
Yeah, I guess the tools are always helpful, but from the beginning, I would start with just talking to people, even though maybe they weren't there from the beginning. They're working around that software, right? Maybe not from the very, very start, but they also should be aware of typical problems, typical places they need to revisit. And this is maybe a good time to like start the like proper analysis, like discovery phase, where also like key point of it is to establish, you know, some kind of relationships with those people, because we work a lot with them, even though you're on a different separate team that has a different mission to modernize things, and this team is doing, you know, the core product work, but it's still a very important place to start talking to people. And I guess the technology might come a bit later. We're working with people, right? So that's very important to have a chat with them to see what actually they have to say about the particular workflow, and yeah, establish some relationship. That's very important, because modernization is a long process, and you'll be dealing with those people for quite often and for a long time, right? So that's important to start. I guess if you start with you know, a tool and then show them this is what I found, this is probably not the best way to start, you know, a relationship with that team, let's say. So but maybe Abdul also has some interesting thoughts on his side.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting problem. I mean, I think with most projects, I think it's really tempting to kind of get into the nitty gritty, and also that's obviously one of the most important aspects of it. I guess talking with more of an analyst hat on, one of the key things I like to know before we go into a modernization is specifically what do we mean by modernization within the context of that application. So I think obviously, you know, that there are many contexts or many kinds of modernizations, if you will. So one might be, as an example, similar to the scenarios that Sam was highlighting, where you have probably a monolith with a lot of behavior. It's very unknown, and you might want to make changes to that software so it's more easy to change. So it's restructuring it, and you want to maintain its existing behavior. But there are also other kinds of scenarios. So it might be that you've got a system that's unperformant, and it's all about kind of improving the performance and throughput of a system. It could be you've migrated a legacy platform to cloud. You want to make it a bit more cloud native, so you want to modernize it in that way, maybe decouple the software in some meaningful way. Or it could be just about general stability. The software is unstable. So for me, the first step to kind of understanding where we should go is understand the problem, right? Why are we modernizing the software? Once we understand that, then I think the conversations you need to have kind of naturally flow from there. And also obviously the technologies, because you can then make a more meaningful decision about what you will and will not touch around the software. So I think that's looking at from the kind of very far left of the process, if you're that's a big priority, and then moving right, I think picking the correct tooling and making sure that you've got a good, preferably automated safety net, especially where there's not much understanding of the system. So you've got essentially input-output tests, golden masters. I do think it's critical in almost any kind of modernization where you're touching that software. So yeah, it's to me it all kind of flows, cascades one to the other. Understand your context, why you're doing it, what is the key outputs, find those relationships, have those conversations, try to understand what we know and don't know, and obviously build that safety net around the software so that any changes you do make don't create regression and make people regret the decision to start modernization projects. I guess as a broad starter for 10.
One question: how do you know you have the right people? We mentioned about sort of making sure that we build those relationships early on with the with people around the software. But how do you know what people to start talking to? And again, I'll see it will depend a bit on, as you said, there's different flavors of software modernization. But if we just pick one of those.
So I think you've got the right person. So who are some of the main characters that I like to see in my team? I like to see people that have worked with that software regularly, and it might not be the usual suspects, right? So if the software is, say, for example, being productionized for a very long time, and there's no more engineers that have worked on it originally, it might be many of the support staff have the most intimate knowledge about how that system works. They're most familiar with its utilization in production. They're most familiar with how the software work, the flows of the software. They might even be kind of familiar with the actual source code, depending on what the application is. So for me, the most important thing is having that person. Now, they might be quite conservative and quite hesitant to change that software. I think that's always a challenge. You might have essentially a bit of a cynic or a pessimist in your team, but that can also be helpful because I think, bringing in other individuals that will probably be doing the actual, heavy lifting of the change, they can be a bit over enthusiastic and unaware of some of the pitfalls that might be there. So I think they're very, very valuable. That said, on the other side, I think you do need fresh eyes. You need someone who might have a experience with modernizing software, might have experience with similar kind of software, but fundamentally is coming at it from a different perspective. Because more often than not, you're working with software that's been managed for a long time, and a lot of the problems have been dealt with potentially by the same people over and over again, and you really need a fresh pair of eyes on the problem that can find maybe a new way forward or a new angle and bring a bit of dynamism to the team. So, in terms of characters, I like a bit of combination of those. And then obviously you need to understand the technology, make sure you've got the right technical individuals within the team. So if you've got Java application, you've got strong Java developers or otherwise. But the other thing I'd also add is that I think it's very useful if you can, depending on how the organization is structured, to have an end-to-end team. So if the software is running on disks or is running on AWS, make sure you've got people with the relevant skills to manage that infrastructure properly, because it's very rare in my experience that you have a large degree of modernization without some way interacting with the hardware that runs that software. So make sure you've got a cross-functional team, and in the same sense, make sure you've also got QAs that will provide that understanding about how the software may be tested and how the kind of testing procedures happen, because you probably need quite a quick feedback cycle, and it's easier to do that within the context of your team. So in summary, I guess, have both people that are very experienced with the software, people who've never seen it, and then you have a cross-functional team that cover all aspects of the kind of life cycle and technical management of the software would be my preference.
Yeah, just if it's some situations actually, like the goal of modernization would be to end up in a place where it is possible to have those cross-functional teams, because a lot of the times at the start that's kind of the problem, right? So there are no clear boundaries. There's more like Java department, platforming department, DevOps department, which is completely contradicting the whole idea of DevOps, basically, right? And like the whole idea of modernization is to start finding those boundaries within the software so that then those teams could be formed around these, actually. One thing I wanted to maybe touch upon in terms of the analysis and discovery phase, maybe in terms of comparing it to like a greenfield project or a typical like maintenance project, for example, right? So it's like modernization teams has this special license really to have, proper amount of time for analysis and discovery compared to like, well, maintenance team, they just have the Kanban boards, the bugs come in and they just need to fix them, right? That's pretty straightforward. With greenfield projects, it's also a bit easier because there's this whole business context, business functionality. It's more or less known from the start, just figuring out the tech stack and get things going. And there's a lot more pressure, I guess, to deliver quickly. I guess in modernization, it's natural that it's expected to have a proper think about what we want to modernize, right? Not to jump the gun too quickly, I guess. So workshops. That's the case at the beginning with as many people as possible. And there will always be that spectrum that you mentioned, Abdul, like between those pessimist cynics to those like super enthusiastic, like unicorn project type people that, just waiting for a moment like this to, now I can finally help out, modernize this thing. And things will crystallize eventually, but you cannot be like talking and discussing those things endlessly. You need to finally make some decisions with your stakeholder. I'm not sure what worked for you, but for example, in my case, always at some points, I see maybe that's enough talking. Let's put things in this matrix of complexity versus business value of modernizing various like workflows, let's say. Have a discussion, then have a discussion with various key people that we previously had workshops with, and then present it to the stakeholder, and then she can see and make the decision. So there is that license for this deeper analysis, discovery workshops, but at some point you need to, okay, that's enough, and let's put it on this matrix. Let's see where we are. Let's pick something and let's talk to the stakeholder. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Maciej. I mean, I really like that last point, and I think it's something that I've seen. The best projects I've been in have been kind of get it done projects, and some of the biggest failures I've seen have been where you have spent months just discussing and talking. I have a personal preference in my head for that kind of sprint zero mentality, like, get everyone together, give yourself maybe a max 2 weeks, and then by that 2 weeks, let's go. Because the other side of that is that, I think you should still be very agile in it, right? Like, make the assumption you will fail first time. Like, you're going to make wrong decisions. The preference is to make those wrong decisions early and just have the safety net around you that those mistakes don't go live if you can. But the only way you're going to find them is by doing the doing, essentially, and seeing what assumptions are not correct. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think, yeah, you can completely get into paralysis analysis with modernization, and I'd say most technical projects for that matter.
Yeah, because it's in most of the cases not only modernizing a piece of software, it's also the test suite, which is, well, first of all, does it exist, first of all, right? So you need to start thinking about it. If not, it's probably in shambles in some way, right? It's mostly end-to-end, and it's more not a testing pyramid, but testing cone, right? It's the other way around, basically, with mostly end-to-end driven tests.
No, I was going to say, I think as well, like not all software modernization projects are equal as well. So it's a case where some people may have a better idea of the problem, going back to what Abdul was saying around sort of looking more at the problem. Whereas other times it might be, we recognize that we're having lots of issues and our software needs to be modernized, but they maybe can't pinpoint it. So there's that work in that analysis and discovery to actually try and we'll shift the focus to where is the actual problem, and then maybe it's like a broader problem, and then you drill down a little bit more. And then, as you said, like you take some action, like maybe you can do some experiments, and then you can say, well, this isn't going to fly, and it's with that experiment mindset, and it's not like we're going to commit to this forevermore, and we're never going to change, and you then effectively do like a death march. It's a case of maybe you do a quick experiment during a sprint, you can present that back to your main stakeholder, who you would hope is someone super enthusiastic in what you're doing. Of course, it's their area of the business that needs to be modernized, and then you can take action. You say this didn't work out, but this may be a viable option, experiment. Yes, this seems like a way to go. And then obviously there's levels to that. Even within we've done this, there'll be many experiments within that. But I think, as you said, like taking action, making sure you can do experiments quick enough to get feedback, I think is super important. So you don't become fixated on we must march down there. So it takes a certain mindset, I think, which is obviously nicely aligned to the agile mindset. But yeah, there's different flavors of software modernization for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well. You say about finding little problems and solving them, because I think it plays into very much about setting expectations with sponsors. So I think that whole point about the problem's very fluffy. I think that's the norm rather than the exception. I think that creates a risk insofar as you talk about modernization and I think, well, we're going to do a 6 months project and by the end of it, I'll have the best software that man has ever known. And the reality is that more often than not, you have a variety of challenges. And if we're really honest, a lot of them you might not want to fix, right? There might not be a priority to your business. And I think coming up with that priority list helps. One, it obviously helps the team kind of settle on a problem to tackle. But it also helps, I think, manage the stakeholders' expectations about what they're going to get in the immediate term. So as an example, maybe we'll remove some stability issues in the immediate term. That's the priority, but that's not going to help you get this kind of fully automated regression. That's something that else we'll have to do a little later on, and then you could start to get into that conversation about what's the top priority and what to do, because modernization, I think we've mentioned before, is an endless activity. Like you will be constantly bringing your software up to date and improving it in a way to bring it to that kind of idea of perfection that you'll never get to. And I think it's quite important for that to be transparent from day one. Otherwise, I think you risk that kind of disappointment at the end of the project.
Yeah, and this is also like us thinking about the end, really. It's like once we're done with this, what you as a business will get out of it, what metrics will be improved, right? Is the lead times, is the mean time to recover, less bugs, faster release cycles. It's like, what are you going to get, right? Because, we're going to modernize this part, great, but like, what is the grander scheme of things in the end? And maybe I'll try to switch a bit the conversation. What do you guys think about like estimating during that time? Because usually, like, there will be some business that will ask for that, like, how long will it take? So what do you think about that initial analysis and estimating? To be honest, I would go like forecasting at this point, but
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the word forecasting, because my mind goes a bit to the weather, and how saying what the weather's going to be like. I mean, even next week can be wrong, right? Even the day before. But from my view, I think going back, similar to what you said, Abdul, around sort of setting expectations, you can give an estimate, which of course is an estimate, but I think particularly early on in a particular scheme of work, it can be quite difficult. And not all projects are equal, some might be a bit more like, we have a reasonable idea of what needs to be done, how long it's going to take, but we always know that things crop up. But I think it can be really difficult. And I do empathize with those who want the estimates as well. As you mentioned, Mac, like some people will be asking, we need to plan our work for, this year, etc. How long is it going to take? And sort of want it sort of packaged, and this is how long it's going to take. It's going to take 6 months, etc. But it can be difficult. I think you as a team should try and do your best, but just with expectation and set expectations. And again, there's obviously, even if you do that, people still might be romantic with the 6 months. It must be 6 months. It can't be a month longer. But everyone's different. But I think you should try your best to estimate and give an idea to those who are modernizing, to say this, I think it's going to take 6 months. But I think it can be difficult. I see both sides. I see the side that want the estimate, of course, because they want to know roughly how long they can sort of package this work. But the recognition that by modernizing it is a commitment, and as it's already mentioned, it is a continuous activity as well. Like, even if you get a scheme of work completed, the act of modernizing goes bigger than just a particular scheme of work. It's a commitment, really, to try keep your things modern, so you don't require the big efforts later on down the line.
Yep.
It's a bit like gardening, right? You can sort of prune everything and keep it regularly good in the garden, or you're gonna have to get the gardeners out, a big team of gardeners to try and go over the garden and sort it out, a couple of times a year. So it's a similar sort of thing. So I think for me, you just need to recognize that it is a commitment, regardless of how long you estimate a piece of work. To modernize is a commitment that you're always going to try and keep your software as modern as possible, whatever that means to your business as well.
I guess my view on it is, so I used to pendulum a lot, like, should we give estimates, should we not? I think the middle way is important. I think for a lot of companies, they're public companies, and you cannot tell them, like, just give me a blank paycheck. Like, they're not going to do it. And rightly so, right? Like, that's bad investment decision. But I think at the same time, there is basically what we're really talking about is risk here, risk of unknowns. So you can look at something, you might have done 20 modernization projects, you're really proficient, and you look at it and you go, wow, that should take me 6 months, right? But the reality, what's going to change that is when you look into the actual software, you look into the problems, and suddenly you hit roadblocks that you never anticipated, and that causes a huge problem. So what we're really talking about here is managing essentially project or budget risk. Now, my perspective on that, I think, is, you follow what is becoming, I feel, or is already the industry best practice when it comes down to managing risk, which is to fail quickly. You have to, I would almost try and flip it around with the stakeholder and say, look, roughly we think it could take 6 months, but it could take longer, it could take less, we just don't know, right? But the question, if they're quite on the ball, which should come back, is to say, okay, how do we manage that unknowns? And I think it's a reasonable question, and this comes back to what we just discussed, is go out there, you have to experiment, you have to quickly find a hypothesis, you need to test it, you need to see if it works, you need to see if there's any real side effects that you can detect so far, and always kind of have that conversation, I feel, with your stakeholders. Look, there's a lot of unknowns. What we're going to try and do to mitigate that unknown is, in the next 2-3 weeks, we're going to just, it's not going to be nice code, we're just going to spike it, we're going to see if these theories work, we're going to see if the improvement is we see the improvement in the right direction, and that the software still operates as we understand it should operate today, and maybe some of those are not quite true. Maybe you sit there and say, wait, the tests, we don't have the tests there, so we're just going to see if the throughput kind of goes in the right direction, see if this is even feasible. And I think then you kind of almost talking like a risk register, and you're starting to decommission some of those unknowns, right? Obviously, there's unknown unknowns, which are even harder to deal with, but I think those are just ones you just have to take. It's almost like acts of God at that point. So I think it's all about that pragmatism. It's all about that communication, and it's also understanding from your stakeholders' perspective. They're taking a risk on you, right? Like, they must have asked someone for that money, and they've come around and they said, look, here's £1 million to modernize your software. To modernize my software. And at that point, they're taking a risk, right? They can't go back up to their stakeholders and say, oh, unfortunately, I spent all the money and got no return on it, because that's their job. So they have a right to be concerned, and you have to work with them on that to make sure their needs are met.
Yeah, it's from my side, it's always been a weird dichotomy with estimating, because you want to be professional, right? And you want to give some kind of an idea to the business decision makers, like what they can expect and what optimistically, pessimistically can happen, let's say. But in terms of the quality of that deliverable, is the least possible quality thing that you can give them, actually, right? So it's least professional thing, right? Because you're never right. It's always going to be, reality is going to be a bit different. So I think that the point that you, Abdul, made is just that continually providing the best idea of that estimation of work to your stakeholders, to your business, is the key. And it'll be changing sprint by sprint even, but the key is to be overt with them, right? With what's going on, so that you're always transparent and they're always aware, basically. And they will see that things keep on changing, and that's just the nature of it, especially a modernization project. So I don't know, to be honest, it's if we have a set of things that are, we do analysis and discovery that we decide to do, I wouldn't spend more than 1 day talking with the team and doing optimistic, pessimistic, realistic estimations and putting it some under some formulas, and that's it. And just keep on updating that as we go. More things will come, some things will go out, and just be overt with your stakeholders. That's pretty much it.
I think thinking in that mindset of what can you deliver in the next week, 2 weeks, month, because the problem is, I guess, with estimating is a lot of times it's like you're thinking about, they want to know, they know that they want to get to here potentially, and it's like, how long do you think it's going to take to get to there? Whereas if you break it down and say, well, we think in this time we can do this, and then that delivers value, and always with that mindset of, well, if I disappeared tomorrow, I'm not planning to, by the way, but if I disappeared tomorrow, would I have delivered some value in this period of time? And then it compounds over time. It compounds and compounds and compounds. And then by the time you get to this point, you've delivered all of this value along the way. Because even during the analysis and discovery phase, that can be super valuable. And some people might overlook it. But even if you can get some data to say, well, width is part of your code, does this particular part of processing, and this is how noisy it is with the database, this is the breakdown of reads, writes, etc., and it's to these 25 tables. Like, that's useful information that most likely they probably don't already have. So it's just that constant mindset of, what can I deliver within this period of time, with a preference to the shorter periods of time. And not overlooking as opportunities as well to say, well, actually, this information itself is valuable, and that can be presented back as well.
That ethos, right? Deliver early and deliver value early and often.
I won't get into the debate around Agile and stuff, but I mean, just the fact that you work in sprints doesn't necessarily mean that you truly internalize that concept and you are thinking about those 2 weeks value. So I think it's definitely a mindset you have to really, really work hard to say, well, what can we actually deliver? And even within that sprint, what can you deliver?
Because, like, from my experience, that initial analysis and discovery phase, especially for like modernization project, it may take more than one sprint, can be 2, 3, sometimes once took even like 2 months. To be honest, that was too much, but sometimes that's what happens, and it's sometimes have a really significant footprint on the team, the morale of the team, the dynamics between the team members. Obviously, they're thrown in. It's maybe the first time they get together. Basically, they still need to know each other, and they are thrown into this analysis discovery phase, which is very stressful. There are a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, and as a team lead, like, you need to be aware from the very first day about it. That's like keeping looking and at the health of the team and the morale of the team, because that initial part, they're engineers, they want to code, they don't want to talk about that initial phase is like very heavy on that. So just wondering what your thoughts about on this.
My perspective on that is that I think a lot of discovery and analysis phases, in my opinion, are too heavy on conversation. It's not to say conversation shouldn't be there, by the way. I think it's really, really important. But I think there's a lot of value in breaking stuff, right? Like, get that app running, like, see what's going on, see, as Sam put, what kind of database reads are going on, writes, etc., so on forth. How talky is it? I think there's a lot to be learned from just playing with the software. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? So I think the analysis and conversation is always demoralizing, I think, because it can be very, very protracted, very detailed. Obviously, for roles like business analysts, they live and breathe the stuff, and they're probably having a whale of a time. But for other roles, it can be very dry, even if they need to know it. But I think that at the same token, I would expect that we would be spending a lot of time just playing with the app, just seeing if we can break it. Like, what does it do? Like, what breaks it? What makes it work? What doesn't? Obviously, it depends on the size of the app as well. Some of the applications we're working with are so huge that breaking it probably is like a multi-week affair in its own right. But especially if it's on the smaller side and you can get it up and running within an hour or two, I think let the team just go wild with it for a bit. Run some performance tests, try to work out the workflows in it. Try to understand how the software relates to it, how it's structured, because these things add value in their own right? So then you can start providing those assets, and they're part of that discovery phase, but they're working a little bit more on the technology side of it and the software side of it, rather than just on the kind of business analysis side of it. So I think good blend of work is very important.
Yeah, and from the get-go, as a team, they try to be that person who's taking care of that organizational stuff, getting to the right people, getting them to the workshops, maybe organizing and thinking about the agendas, and making sure the team of those engineers, like talented engineers, they can leverage their skills like from the very beginning, like looking at what's actually there, basically, right? An interesting thing in terms of like eventually you will need to have those discussions and some decisions made, and this needs to happen. So like from my experience, it might get a bit chaotic, and what I tried is, so we called it like a decision meeting kind of a thing. So instead of going for hours and hours about something, because at that initial stage is that's kind of the case, just have 15 minutes, decide what we are trying to decide upon, what are the pros and cons. If it's like a 6+ people team, go into breakout rooms, have like a 5-minute conversations in pairs, then come back. And there's usually 2-to-1, or there's just like a clear majority wanting to do this one thing, and the other just have to disagree and commit, and that's it. 15 minutes, go on, and let's continue, basically. So not sure how like you manage that, like once the decision needs to be made, and those having those discussions, bringing those discussions to the minimum, basically.
But I think it comes back to, I guess, the previous discussion as well, in terms of the team lead and that management as well, because you need to set expectations. Just to in the previous discussion, we're talking about how it's going to be hard work. There's going to be lots of meetings, lots of discovery. There's going to be lots of information as well. And we mentioned like setting up repositories and stuff. Even that can be a mission in itself, depending on the repository. So like just setting expectations with the team, I think, can definitely help. Like the fact that guys, this is going to be hard work. This isn't going to be easy. But I think as much as possible, try and face the problems and the uncertainty as well. Like Abdul said about just spin up the application, having a look at it, because you might hear lots about it. You might hear oh, this application has been around for 60 years or whatever. I don't know if any software survived that long, but if it has, congratulations. But then it's a case of looking at it, and you might look at it, and actually that kind of veil of mystique and stuff, actually you sort of pull it away, and actually it's not how bad. It's sort of those small battles, I think, definitely help. And in terms of like the making decisions, I think what can help there is that process of tackling the problems and the sort of the lack of information, because you're not going to have 100% information making these decisions, especially early on in the project, and potentially not even later on. You still might not have all of the information. But I think the crucial thing is to try and tackle those areas of uncertainty and try and get them, whether that means pulling someone in who has more context, who has been working with the software to try and help share their knowledge. I think trying to give the team information and try and remove some of the guesswork, I think can definitely help, because sometimes otherwise you're sort of just having a high level discussion, apples and oranges, and it's not really super productive. Whereas if you can add a bit more information, a bit more context to that, and say, well, actually what we're talking about, is a Granny Smith apple or whatever, it can definitely help. And I'm sure you love my analogies, but that can definitely help there, I think, in those discussions with the team. And I think your idea as well, Mac, definitely makes sense. Sort of that idea of constraining the time to make a decision. Otherwise, if you say to someone, "Oh, you have a year to make a decision," then they're going to take a year to make the decision, right? If not more. So, yeah, absolutely.
The way I see that, I think there's two problems there. One is essentially dealing with unknowns and the fear associated to it. The other one is around essentially team decision making, which I think is always contentious, right? It's a very sensitive affair. On the first one, I think there's that natural cutoff. I mean, that's why I always like the time box spikes. I think we've all had experience of the spike that goes on for approximately forever. And often you say, well, we don't know everything. You'll never know everything, right? When you really boil it down to anything in life, we don't know much. It's unknowns are part of life. So you have to kind of blend acquisition of knowledge with dealing with fear. So I think often than not, why is there like an anxiety by just playing with an application? It's not going to production or anything. It's just your local version of this code. Who cares? Like, you can make a mess of it. No one cares. But there's a fear of failure. Like, oh no, like what if it goes wrong? It doesn't matter. And then I think the second point around team commitment and disagreement, I think that's harder, actually, in my opinion. I think it's harder because I think people conflate the difference between the decision not going your way and you not being heard, right? So you have a group discussion. We all come, for whatever reason, whether it's because people more senior in the team think we should go this way, or it's group collective decision, whatever, it goes the way another team member didn't want. And I think often that can feel like a personal rejection, right? Oh, you didn't think my opinion was valuable. I think we've got to try and remove that from the team if possible, and make sure everyone has that kind of mutual respect where we understand we're professionals. Everyone has been heard, and it's really important. I think everyone is heard. And then at the end of that, make sure it's understood that this is the decision that's been made for X, Y, Z reason, and it's not a reflection of, a reflection of the competence of the individual that proposed maybe an alternative approach. We need to remove that personal aspect in many ways from the professional decision, to make sure it doesn't fester, which is hard, to be honest, but I think it's important.
Yeah, it's also important to mention that as a team lead, for example, it's like you really need to understand that your team members are really, if it's like a 50-50 situation and the discussion goes on forever, they're fine talking about it forever, but in the end, they're looking at you to make that final call. Okay, you heard enough, I think, and you should be like aware this is enough. Let's say we're just overthinking at this point and we're going to do this. I'm taking ownership of that, whatever happens. And that should alleviate a bit, that those concerns maybe that still some people have about maybe this decision, right? So it's takes the ownership of that, and that's it. Let's move on to something else.
Depending on the decision, it might not be forever. It might be we're going to decide to run this experiment over this one. Brilliant, we do it. See the results. Actually, the results don't look as good. Let's try the other one. So it really depends. But
let's go and fail. Let's go and fail, right?
Exactly.
So right? So
exactly.
And again, it's the lead that should bring that confidence that it's fine that we do it, right? We'll just try something. Right? I'm taking the ownership of that, and I'm sure we'll figure it out along the way.
One area I'd like to look at next is sort of like the measurement of software modernization. How do you stop it becoming, this is maybe philosophical in some ways in the sense of the broader software development, but how do you stop it from becoming an endless task and have some metrics and measurements around it, and also establish those early enough so you have targets that you're aiming for?
So maybe I'll give my idea of it. Let's say maybe I'm interested in what you think about it, but you have to keep in mind that you'll be modernizing, but there are 10 more other teams that are still developing their software, and they're still doing it in a legacy sort of way because that's what they used to, right? So even though that's you would be modernizing this piece of software, 10 other teams would be bringing 10x more legacy stuff because that's what they used to do. And so one of the end goals is obviously modernize to prove that this is the way to go. This is the state of the art libraries, frameworks that we will be using for it. This is the testing pyramid we'll use. This is maybe some SDLC automation that we like to flavor modernization with so that things go faster. And as quickly as possible, to be honest, try to show these findings to as many of those product teams as possible so that they start developing new features, new software with these new practices so that new stuff is not legacy from the get-go. And really, you will just won't get anywhere as a modernization team if you'll be working in a silo and we are modernizing, don't touch us, and everyone else will be still doing legacy, and you will never get anywhere. The point is prove things, and then as leverage use all those product teams to at least create new features with those new findings, let's say.
So I think from my side, I always would take it back to the business case. So as I think mentioned earlier, I think we need to understand what's the objective behind modernization. There's different kinds of modernization. There has to be a business objective, right? You're investing money, you expect return. So I think there needs to be an understanding of what's the primary expectation, what the stakeholder want to get out of it. And I think that should form a big part of your metric. So if you're looking to improve performance, then that should be a key metric. If it's to improve ability to change that software, so your delivery speed, your time to change, then I think that needs to be a primary metric as well, etc., so on and so forth. And with that in mind, I think then you've got that clear flow. You've got, this is what we want to do. We want to be able to maybe like release daily, and then there's that the changes and the prioritization that happens then, because what will give us our biggest bang for buck, and then we should see that effect on the change. And I think it also helps with the, as we discussed just a moment ago about those conversations, right? Because then that's where the value is. So if someone says, hey, I think we should do X, and you say, well, how is that going to help us achieve our objective of making sure that the software is more easy to change? And if they can't come up with a good justification compared to something else, and I think that's clearly that other thing's more important. So I think that's how I would always do. I try to flow it from what is it we're trying to achieve in the project from a business kind of perspective, and that would be one of my primary measures, alongside other kind of measures that are important for your software as well, to make sure it's not regressing, and hopefully in line with the kind of Scout rule, is improving as you kind of peripherally improve the software.
So I guess maybe if we like combine like our ideas, right? So it's like moving out like those ideas, and making sure that other teams are creating software the way we figure out during modernization, but also having those business measurements in mind. It's like maybe one of the best bets, because sometimes if we modernize, it's a quite lengthy process, and usually the systems are a bit large, so it's hard to see like movement in those metrics just by that modernization team delivering some modernized piece of code. It would be quite hard. But if we would measure those new features that those product teams are building with those new practices, and it should be far easier to see like faster lead times, less bugs, and more releases, let's say, instead of just looking at the modernization team effort and deliverables and metrics of that.
I agree, and I disagree just slightly. I think it depends on the metric we're talking about and the business metric. I think some things should be clear, right? And not always the case, because obviously we know clients come with legacy software, usually come from legacy organizations. But if we take, for example, like one aspect of modernizations might be compliance. So that's, looking at your compliance risk of your software, I think should be like, absolute paramount, and that profile should go down. And I think that when you talk about one of the ones I did was performance long time ago, and we literally measured it every iteration, and we were doing 3-day iterations just to see it go down. I think it might be an ideal. I would say that. I think a lot of organizations, it's very challenging to get that kind of level of focus, but I think it's something we should aspire to. Like, we should really be saying, like, is it improving what we need it to improve? And then I think also helps with what you said about kind of selling it out, because then we can say, look, this software does improve things. It makes your database connections cleaner. It makes them more performant. You're using less of them. So I think it's really like important, at least in my mind, to like have that crystal clear idea about what is it that we're trying to achieve here, for that whole package, as you've kind of said.
Yeah, it's just like using those product teams as leverage to prove that in some way. Obviously, yeah, exactly.
Depending on the metric, you'll be able to there'll be sort of milestones, there'll be value. I think Abdul, earlier on, you mentioned the release cadence. That may start off as like could be once a year, could be 6 months. You sort of start to bring that down over time, and it might not. You might not meet the quoted we want to release daily straight away, but you could at least start to see some progress along the way. And this goes back to what I was saying before around if that was it and you just that the software modernization team working on that disappeared tomorrow, at least you would have seen some measurable progress and there was some impact. You'd of course hope that you get it all the way to the daily releasing if that's what they want, but yeah, it's that kind of drip feeding of value, I think, is super important. And obviously, if you have the measurements in place to be able to track that, then that's brilliant because you can see how far are we off that. And also, in the rare case that maybe you made a change that made the releases take longer, you would be able to measure that and say, actually, we've made them take slightly longer by amending this process, etc., etc.
Like from the very beginning, be clear with your stakeholders, with the business that's like in this kind of project, it will take some time before these will nudge, let's say. We'll see a change in these metrics, right? So you need to give us some time. Obviously, you'll try to measure them from the beginning, but probably we're looking at more like a marathon.
Yeah, it depends on the scale as well. Depends on the scale of the engineering teams, etc. Because maybe for one engineering team, maybe they have a slightly different process, and maybe for them you could maybe see that they would release faster, but maybe you then need to rinse and repeat that process for like the other teams as well. Whereas if you're sort of on one big grand release train, then it might be slightly harder to impact if you can't sort of siphon off a particular area. Another great discussion. Again, we covered some ground, but even just a small slice of the pie, we still have much more to talk about.
We still didn't start modernizing things.
Yeah, we still haven't started modernizing. We're gonna be fired. No. So any closing thoughts? Any takeaways or closing thoughts, or anything in particular that you think you definitely want to delve into next time?
I think it's those 3 sessions proof, like how much there is before you even get to modernizing things, like how much things you need to consider, discuss, and prepare, let's say, before. Even though at some point we discuss it still should be like an agile iterative thing, it still has more thought that you need to put to it than to other types of projects, I think. So yeah, but we're really looking forward to start modernizing during our discussion. So.
I guess the key takeaway would be the amount, balancing you have to do, right? So, it's all about you're doing that discovery, but then you also need to make sure that you're focused on failing quickly and getting that feedback. It's very multifaceted. And I think it is a hard balance to achieve, but it makes the modernization project so interesting and quite a rich field, I guess, for opportunities to learn.
I'll have to go last. I think the crucial thing for me is the discipline. Similar to what you said, Abdul, I think the discipline involved in a software modernization project. We have lots of examples throughout this discussion. Making decisions, making sure that experiments are short, and we don't end up with the forever spike that you mentioned, Abdul. It's that constant discipline needed. I think helps make a software modernization. Either a piece of work or a wider scheme of work helps make that a success because it is a constant battle. There'll be lots of forces that will be sort of going against you. I think the discipline is the crucial thing. I think people need whilst working in software modernization. Alrighty, well, I guess until next time, thank you for listening and watching, and we'll see you again.